The mass media are, in the first place, major corporations. You know, that's what they are. They are some of the biggest corporations in the country, and they're closely interlocked with other corporations. In fact, they are part of the small network of individuals and interests which effectively own the private economy and staff the state executive. If you look at the people who hold the high planning positions in the state executive under any administration, they come from corporate boardrooms, investment banks, half a dozen law firms that cater to corporate interests, and so on. There are a number of studies of this if you're interested. That's the same group of people, the same interests who own the media. So naturally they share a perception of the world and general interests. That's at the top level. Now I suppose you get down to the editorial level or the reporter's level. Well, you know, at that point, you find pressures to conform. A young journalist will quickly learn that certain things are reportable and other things aren't. You can say things in a certain way and you can't say things in other ways. And you learn it from your editors, or the people right above you, and they've learned it from the people right above them. Remember, corporations are the private equivalent of what we call fascism in the political realm. The decision-making structure in a corporation is top-down. You give orders and they get executed by down below and so on and so forth, and the orders ultimately come from the owners. Furthermore, the media have a market. That market is other corporations. The market for the media is advertisers. Remember, the media do not make their money on sales to you and me. In fact, every purchase of a newspaper or journal usually costs them money. Right? That's the way the political economy of the media work. Their market is advertisers, which imposes yet another constraint. They want to maintain a relationship to the state, which is their friends. You know, there's a kind of interpenetration up and back. In fact, even the individuals flow up and back. You know, Bernard Kalb, Leslie Gelb, et cetera, of course they flow up and back because they represent the same interests. There's a constant flow between corporate boardrooms, state managers, media executives and top-level media people, university elites who play the game by the rules and so on. They all belong to the same privileged elite. They all benefit the same way. They perceive the world the same way. If any of them get out of line, they're excluded. And that can happen even at a very high level. So, for example, a couple of years ago, the top editorial staff of the New York Times was essentially thrown out, John Oakes and others, because they were beginning to deviate a little bit. And if you look at the mechanisms, it's very clear. A couple of years, I think it was about the mid-'70s, there began to be reports in the business press, the Wall Street Journal, the Business Week, pointing out subtly that New York Times stock was declining on the stock market. And they pointed out, here I'm quoting, they said, if the New York Times doesn't realize that it's a business, soon it won't be in business any longer. Well, and in fact they did replace a good part of the top editorial board at that time. What was the great crime that the New York Times was committing at that point? Well, if you look back, it turns out that they were editorially supporting some very mild fiscal reform measures that business didn't happen to like. And that was enough to set in motion the technique of control. You'll notice that the state is under exactly the same technique of control in a capitalist democracy. Suppose that the state, in fact, is staffed by those who have resources. But suppose it tried to deviate. Suppose it started to pursue policies that didn't conform to the interests of those who make the investment decisions, who essentially own the place. Well, what would happen, in fact does happen, is a decline in investment, the beginning of capital flight, just a little bit, enough to tell them that the country is going to go down the tube unless they go back to the main course. Now, what that means is that when true decision-making power is in private hands, the political system is marginal and the ideological institutions are limited. And incidentally, these conditions almost never arise because they're all staffed by people with the same interests and the same background and the same perception anyway. Getting back again to the reporter, they just shape up, or else they're out. And what typically, incidentally, this happens in universities too. Those of you who are going on in the ideological professions, the social sciences and so on, you'll learn this. You'll learn that you got to conform. Now, it's not 100%. You know, the system is willing to tolerate statistical error. But it's got to be enough so that there isn't any significant deviation. And you do come under pressures to conform, all sorts of pressures. You'll find out what they are if you don't know already. And those pressures are effective. What they do is weed out independent people. And for the people who decide to, there's also something very interesting, which you might as well be aware of if you haven't faced it yet, because it'll happen. What happens is that if you decide, well, I'll conform a little, you know, I'll do what they say, but I'll keep my independence of mind. As soon as you begin to do that, you're lost, unless you're a very rare individual. Because what happens is you begin to conform, you begin to get the privilege of conformity, you soon come to believe what you're saying because it's useful to believe it, and then you've internalized the system of indoctrination and distortion and deception, and then you're a willing member of the privileged elites that control thought and indoctrination. That happens all the time, all the way to the top, you know. I mean, it's a very rare person, very rare, almost to the point of non-existence, who can tolerate what's called cognitive dissonance, you know, saying one thing and believing another. You start saying certain things because it's necessary to say them, and pretty soon you're believing them, because you just have to. There is no atrocity, in my view, that we know of, that has been carried out in the world that wasn't justified by its perpetrators as highly moral. That includes, incidentally, Nazi genocide. You know, you read Himmler's diaries to go to the sort of extreme, and it's all full of how noble this is and how much strength it requires and so on and so forth. Slavery was justified by the slave owners with moral arguments. If we had records from Attila the Hun, we'd probably find out that what he was doing was highly moral, you know, same with Stalin and every mass murderer in history. And it happens at a much lower level for individuals. Incidentally, you're all familiar with this from your personal lives, and it's worth bearing in mind. So like I doubt if there's anybody here who hasn't done pretty rotten things in their life at some time, but I also am willing to bet that every one of you has figured out a way to make that exactly the right and moral and proper thing to do, okay? And that's what happens when you become parts of institutions too. So that's the way the indoctrination works on the participants. And it ends up being a very effective system, ultimately rooted in control over resources, exactly as you'd expect. It's not very mysterious. Some people talk about it as this is a conspiracy theory. That's really idiotic. It's not a conspiracy. You know, like if the board of managers of General Motors decides to maximize profit, that's not a conspiracy. In fact, if they didn't do it, they'd be thrown out. You know, that's the institutional role they have to play. And the ideological institutions also have a role that they have to play within a nexus of institutions, and if they don't play that role, or if individuals within them don't play that role, they'll be replaced by others who do, because these are institutional facts, like the arms race.